Good afternoon, good evening to wherever you may be tuning in from. I'm Michael Kimmage, the director of the Kennan Institute at the Wilson Center, and it's my great pleasure to introduce two very distinguished speakers today. But before I do so, I would like to thank Lenny Lapato for putting this event together, and also like to direct our viewers and listeners to the work that's being done on the Kennan Institute website or via the Kennan Institute website on many of the issues that we'll be discussing in the next hour. And so that would be the Focus Ukraine and Russia File blogs and podcasts as well. So please do check those out for further context and an analysis of current events. I'm going to give very brief introductions, in part because I think we have very well-known speakers, but also because there's so many achievements on both accounts that we could spend a good 20 minutes reviewing them. So I'll just give affiliations: Liana Fix at the Council on Foreign Relations, and Sam Charap at the RAND Corporation. Again, two wonderful experts and friends. So welcome virtually to the Kennan Institute. And the format for today's conversation will be about 40 minutes of conversation among the three of us. And after that, we'll take questions from the audience. So you can submit those via the chat function of the Zoom call. And please do so at any time. So you can send them in whenever. And we'll look forward to discussing your questions for the last 20 minutes of today's conversation. So I'd like to start with you, Liana, and then we'll address the same question to you, Sam, about the challenges when it comes to war termination. So we're going to spend the lion's share of our time today talking about war termination, what that might mean, what that might look like. But I wanted to start, in a sense, at the opposite end of the question and to review some of the difficulties, the challenges that the US, Europe, Ukraine, and Russia all face when it comes to terminating the war. So Liana, let's start with you.
Thanks so much, Michael. Thanks for the invite. It's wonderful to be here with you. And Sam, certainly on a day that will have an impact on the outcome of war termination. We have all probably seen the exchange in the White House. And that leads me to the 2 points that I want to make on the war termination question. The first is the war termination itself. What is the outcome and how it is going, what are the contents going to be out of the end of a potential outcome? But I think equally important is what we should discuss today is also the process. How do we get to this outcome, and how will the process influence what the outcome will look like? I will start with the process. We already have a process now that is in place. The process is structured along a US-Russian bilateral channel of communications, and then Ukraine talks being in a separate working groups on that. There have been different models proposed how a process toward termination into these talks can look like. A broader table where Europeans would also have a place, the United States together with Ukraine and Russia. What we see in the setup of this line of US-Russian bilateral talks and then a discussion with Ukraine is something that points to a very clear both agency and ownership from Trump's side there to talk directly with Putin. But it also has certainly raised concern that the process of war termination might in this setup not have the goal of finding a sustainable solution to the outcome of the war in Ukraine, but being primarily about the US-Russia bilateral relationship and about normalizing ties on the US-Russian bilateral level, something that from the Russian side is framed as, well, first we need to see whether we can get along on certain issues, on the embassies, on prisoners exchanges, and then we work on Ukraine as a subset of the bilateral relationship. So that is a setup of the process toward termination, which is which certainly is to be debated controversially whether that can lead to an outcome which is sustainable. And then if we come to the actual content of the war termination part, there are certainly certain red flags from a European and Ukrainian side. Those red flags are any interferences in Ukraine's domestic affairs, Russian say in Ukrainian elections, Russian impositions on the size of the Ukrainian military. So there are a number of issues that are on the plate. Territories, NATO membership, that's something the United States has already taken away. But there are certain red flags which would make a deal a bad deal for Ukraine, and a deal which is incredibly difficult to accept, and potentially a deal where Europeans might say, well, we would support Ukraine in saying no to such a deal. And those red flags are flags that have already been mentioned by the negotiation team that we see right now. The Istanbul talks as a framework for that. Sam can talk more about this and has written about this, which includes these two red flags about reducing the size of the Ukrainian military and Ukrainian elections. But this is going to be, for the outcome, this is going to be the crucial question. Is a deal acceptable to Vladimir Putin without the red flags that I've just outlined? And how much leverage will Ukraine have in the end to actually say no to a deal that includes these red flags? Or will this only be a no that they can sustain for 1 or 2 years at maximum? I'll leave it there for the moment.
Well, thank you so much, Leon. I mean, there's a cliche about Afghanistan that it's the graveyard of empires. I sometimes feel with diplomacy related to Ukraine, it's kind of the graveyard of diplomacy in some ways. We could go back in time just on the motif of red flags that you mentioned to the Budapest Memorandum of the 1990s, which ended up not being particularly binding or effective. And then Minsk I and Minsk II, 2014, 2015, where there was a lot of diplomatic activity and effort expended, and that, sort of unraveled over time. And here we are again, discussing this topic, and the track record is, I guess one could say, putting it very neutrally, the track record is cautionary in terms of diplomatic aspirations and outcomes. But Sam, let me turn to you with the same question about the obstacles you see when it comes to war termination, or the core challenges.
So I guess I'm going to focus more narrowly on this question of challenges, but try to think about them in more categorical terms, and just as a thought experiment here. I mean, I think the three most important ones are obviously the divergence in objectives. I think if you were to take particularly the maximalist versions of the party's objectives, they're pretty divergent. But that's probably true in any war that's ever been fought in the history of, wars. Wars are usually fought because the sides have divergent objectives. In this case, it might be true that, external parties, maybe the US, the EU, have different, their own set of objectives that might not completely overlap with either of the two belligerents. But that is going to be something that's obviously has to be managed in the course of a potential effort to end the war. The second piece of this, and my first answer gets at this, is the fact that this is a multi-stakeholder dynamic, to use, neologisms, but nonetheless, that there are many parties' interests affected, and at the very least, Europe, which includes the UK as well as the EU, and its constituent member states, even some additional countries have been quite involved, like Norway, as well as the United States and Ukraine and Russia, arguably also Ukraine and Russia's immediate neighbors, like Belarus, has been essentially a co-belligerent in some ways with Russia. And so it's not simply, you can't resolve this at a table with one side on one side of the table and the other party on the other side of the table. There are going to need to be multiple tables, and in some cases with multiple parties at them. And finally, I would point to the technical challenges that negotiators will face in the context of negotiating into this war. Just looking at the ceasefire modalities, this is if you count the undisputed areas of the Ukraine, Belarus, and Ukraine-Russia border, as well as the line of contact, it's essentially a 2,000-kilometer line, which is just, unprecedentedly long in terms of conflicts. It has geography that spans from the sort of forests of and swamps of Polessia to the steppe in the east and the Black Sea coast and even into the maritime domain. It is going to be an immense technical challenge to both, design mechanisms that lead to a sustainable cessation of hostilities, and ensure compliance with it going forward, putting aside the political difficulties that are associated with that. And there are lots of other sort of challenging, technical is probably not the right word, but substantive issues that are going to need to be worked out as part of any final arrangement. I would just maybe react to a couple of other things that have been said, though, perhaps. I think that it's early days yet, and despite the headlines that we've seen today, even when it comes to what the new administration's potential approach to this conflict is, it's unclear to me that we really know what process will be in place. The only thing we see so far are channels to address longstanding bilateral issues. We don't really see an active channel on war-related matters, frankly. And one meeting does not a process make, neither does two, frankly. So I think it's a bit too early to say anything definitively about that. And I would also add, I think the raising of the Istanbul Agreement has generated perhaps predictable antibodies. So first of all, there is no Istanbul Agreement, and there was no agreement finalized as part of that process in the spring of 2022. But I would just say two things. One, it does, in the abstract, make sense that you would return to the document that was on the table the last time the parties were at the table, particularly when at least one side is talking about it as the frame through which they want to talk about, next steps in the process. Now, that doesn't mean that it's going to be adopted. It, by the way, doesn't exist, that the document that was being hashed out at the time is going to be the immediate basis for negotiations. Clearly, a lot has changed in the interim. But I would note that the only part of the Istanbul affair that was actually agreed was the communique, which was issued on March 29th, 2022, which did not include any of the demilitarization stuff, and was mostly about the issue of security guarantees. In fact, the language of that communique is more binding than Article 5 of the Washington Treaty. But we can get into that, I suppose, a little bit later on.
Wonderful. Thanks so much to you both for laying out really what for negotiators, observers, actors in this war are the core challenges, ranging from process. Liana, you mentioned the question of territory. You mentioned also the unacceptability of a bad deal, especially for Ukraine. And Sam, you raised the question of the number of countries involved, the very, very complex geometry of diplomacy that would have to be enacted for a true solution to be achieved, the sort of the mechanisms, and then the templates, sort of hopefully bringing us back to the Istanbul negotiations at the very beginning of the war back in 2022. But we are here, of course, to talk about war termination. So maybe I'll start first with you, Sam, and then go to Liana, and take your pick in terms of which country most interests you to comment on. I want to get your sense of what factors and forces are compelling war termination, because I think it is fair to say, as we now commence the fourth year of the war, that it feels closer somehow. It's not that I can really envision what the end of the war looks like, but it feels closer than it did in the first or second year of the war. And I think there are a variety of factors that are creating that impression, whether it's true or not. So starting with you, Sam, either on the Russian side, the Ukrainian side, European side, or the US side, important factors that are pushing toward an end to the war.
Those that exist now? Like, why are we having this conversation now?
Correct. Yeah. What in your view is what are the headwinds when it comes to war termination?
headwinds.
Pushing in that direction,
Um,
yeah.
Well, that's a tailwind, isn't it?
What are they? Sorry to
Um,
my winds backwards.
okay. Well, I mean, I think that there's there. I think there are a couple factors going on here. I do think that regardless that even if there had been a different outcome of the U.S. presidential election, that we would have likely seen a pivot to some form of a move towards negotiations from the U.S. in this year, 2025. And that is just because the previous strategy has sort of reached a dead end where, essentially the battlefield dynamic was heading in a direction that was not in Ukraine's favor. And there was no sign that any of the pressure being put on Russia was actually producing the desired result in any time frame that could conceivably have had an impact. So I think that there were sort of structural dynamics that were pushing towards a U.S. move to the table in 2025. Obviously, I think it would have been done, in different ways under different presidents. But frankly, the key factor here, right, is that that the President of the United States has prioritized a cessation of hostilities, and that has completely shaken up the entire international dynamic surrounding the war. Now, one thing it hasn't shaken up is the situation on the ground so far, right? Like the war is ongoing, some of it in some cases extremely intensely, and both, on the front end in terms of deep strikes. But in terms of the international politics of this, it's quite clear that the U.S. has sort of demonstrated that it's had a lot of latent leverage that it hadn't used before, and now when it decides to use it, it completely changes the dynamic. I mean, just think about last year. There was attention being paid to the Chinese peace plan and the Chinese-Brazilian peace plan and the other, this, that, and other. And now that's not even part of the conversation anymore. The exclusive focus is on what it is that the new administration is seeking to do. So I do think that kind of underscores how central the U.S. role is in all of this.
Liana, maybe that tees you up to speak, at least in part, about the European side of things. I don't know if you'd want to comment on the German election in this regard. It's sort of hard to read the tea leaves of that in terms of the war more generally. But and to make sure I get my winds right, the tailwinds that are there in Europe, or if you wish, in Ukraine and in Russia, that are pointing at least in the direction of trying to end the war.
Yeah, I would agree with Sam that the main factor is US political pressure and US political willingness to want to have the war end, right? And there's certainly an argument to make that the Biden administration was too focused on process instead of an end goal in this war. How is this going to look like in the end? The counter argument is that the Trump administration now is focused too much on the end goal and not on the process at all. That the aim is something to have something like a ceasefire in place just for the sake of ending the fighting, which in itself is not something which is, which is undesirable. Of course, an ending to the fighting is desirable, but here obviously the concern is that just stopping the fighting from a European perspective, this is a huge concern after 2014, will not help because it will only stop the fighting for a couple of years, or for how long the Russian side wants a ceasefire to hold until Ukraine will be attacked again. And that's where the whole discussion about security guarantees and so on comes in. The other point about sort of what's the main force and what's driving is the question, if the US is the main driving force here, what role does the US foresee for itself in these talks? And it's pretty clear that the White House these days doesn't see itself as the ally of Ukraine, but rather as a mediating role that has been said very explicitly. And certainly the concern from a European perspective here is that even this mediating role is not pursued in an effort that gives equal chances to both sides, but that Ukraine and Zelensky are perceived as the main problem in ending this war. That's partly to be seen, but partly there has been some evidence to confirm these concerns, where the administration has started out quite strongly with pressure on Russia in the first 2 weeks after January 20. This kind of pressure has rather given into an incentive approach towards Russia, which obviously has been welcomed to Moscow, and it remains to be seen whether these incentives will actually be implemented and in return for what kind of results. We've seen sanctions relief and so on mentioned without a clear conditionality. What does it mean? What will the United States get in return for that? The Europeans are here, unfortunately, in a back seat. They can increase their leverage, for example, by filling the gap that the Trump administration will leave in terms of security guarantees and putting a European mission into Ukraine. That is one of the few options next to US weapon deliveries that is left for Ukraine in terms of security guarantees, which is a very wide and unprecise word, but obviously has its own risks for Europeans too, credibility of NATO Article 5. The other asset that they have are Russian frozen assets that they can still use to at least increase the leverage that they have. And for the Europeans, at some point, the question will be, if the negotiation is perceived as one-sided, and if the outcome is a bad deal for Ukraine, will Europeans at some point have to support Ukraine to be able to say no to such a deal? And if I'm not saying that this will happen, but it can happen, certainly after the events of today, and that will be an incredibly difficult choice to make for Europeans, because supporting Ukraine for what then is the question, sort of, for without US weapon deliveries and so on. It's only a question of time for how long Ukraine can hold out, and then also to risk the ire of the Trump administration if the Europeans also do not support a bad deal on Ukraine. So that's the worst case scenario. We are not there yet. Perhaps we will not get an outcome or scenario after all. It's entirely unclear how Russia is going to continue negotiating here, apart from trying to put out narratives that might appeal to Donald Trump, to put out incentives to Donald Trump, and so on. But from a perspective of conflict resolution, that would certainly be the worst case scenario if everything just blows up.
So let me pause here just to say to anybody who's joined the conversation in the last few minutes that your questions are most welcome, but please submit them to the Q&A function in the chat, and we'll start getting to them in about 17, 18 minutes. So I'll start now with you, Liana, and go to Sam. There's a well-known book by Richard Holbrooke which has the title "To End a War," and the book has many cinematic qualities to it, and I think it creates something of a ideal, typical, or stereotypical image of how wars end. So you have a discrete phase on the battlefield, a point of exhaustion is reached, diplomacy then ensues, something is signed, a paper is signed, the war kind of comes to an end. We might think back to the First World War, which more or less ends in this manner as well. But I wouldn't want to suggest that that's the only way that wars end. Wars end in many different ways, and I wanted to ask both of you to speculate, and if you want to choose what you think is perhaps the most likely outcome, it would be interesting to hear, knowing, of course, as you say, Liana, that much is deeply, deeply unclear. But the term ceasefire has already come up. We have sort of partial ceasefire. We have a negotiated ceasefire. Sam, I know that you've written a lot about the notion of armistice and what that signifies and what that means. It seems possible to me also that the war could end in some form or fashion without there being an agreement about its ending, or of course the Richard Holbrooke style diplomatic ending where it's really negotiated, agreed to, and formalized as possible as well. But I want to start with you, Liana, to get your sense of when we say war termination. I like the word termination because it's kind of multi-faceted and doesn't commit you to much, but how might you flesh out this notion of termination, the different meanings of termination?
Yeah, I think two good examples to look at are the 2008 war termination between Russia and Georgia and the 2014 war termination in the two Minsk agreements. And there are other international examples, global examples that we can discuss, but I think these two are particularly interesting because, just as a reminder for Europeans, the way how the Russian-Georgia war has been ended in 2008 is probably what Europeans would now perceive as the nightmare scenario, how this war would end, which was completely acceptable at the time in 2008. So what we saw in 2008 is that French President Nicolas Sarkozy flew to Moscow after the first couple of days of the war, negotiated an agreement with Moscow, flew back to Tbilisi, tried to convince the Georgian president at that time to Saakashvili to sign that agreement, who was able to do some small changes to the agreement text. And then the EU committed a monitoring force, the EU monitoring mission to Georgia. Russia finally complied after, let's say, 2 months, I think roughly 2 months, with the basic terms of the agreement and withdrew its forces from Tbilisi, but it never complied with the full sense of the agreement. It, for example, never allowed the European monitoring mission to monitor the non-Georgian side of the contact line and so on. And European leaders after that quickly went to a normalization of relations with Russia. Actually, the argument was, well, we need more, not less Russia after this war. So that seems from today's perspective as something which one would not want to model, but it's just good to remind ourselves of how things have been in 2008. Certainly by now we have a different understanding of Russia's leadership, of Russia's actions, of Russian foreign policy. And then obviously the other example, the Minsk agreements in 2014, where something was negotiated without any military backup, without military weapon deliveries to Ukraine. And again, a monitoring mission, which was not allowed on both sides of the monitoring line, the OSCE monitoring mission, which did a great job, but was unable to change anything about the political dynamics or hold anyone accountable for the violations that we have seen. So these two outcomes are certainly models that are very much imaginable for Ukraine today. The biggest difference that many analysts, observers have hoped would be the difference for Ukraine today is that they will be armed. Even if they don't get outside security guarantees, they will be armed and they can continue this fight. And I do think at this point of time, we have to put even that into question. It's unlikely that Europeans will stop their deliveries, weapon deliveries to Ukraine, but they cannot make up for what the United States delivers. And this question for Ukraine will be the crucial one. If there's a ceasefire, will the United States continue to support Ukraine militarily? I would have said yes more resolutely today morning than I do say it now.
Sam, I know you've written much on this topic of different scenarios or different models, different theories of war termination. So let me pass the question over to you.
So your question was really about forms of war termination, and there's a lot of both qualitative and quantitative scholarship on this subject. I think probably fair to say most of the 2000s it was focused on civil wars. It has moved back in the last 5 to 10 years to interstate. But if you look at interstate conflicts, we know one category of ending, which is not really applicable here, which is an absolute victory, where you completely militarily defeat one side, completely militarily defeats the other, and essentially it no longer poses a threat to the victor. So putting that aside, because I think that's highly unlikely in this case, essentially you have different forms of negotiated outcome then. I mean, that's basically your only alternative to an absolute victory. And interstate wars very rarely do not end with a negotiated outcome. And the exceptions to that are like very sui generis cases like the Suez Crisis or some things along those lines, and where one side wasn't completely defeated, but nonetheless withdrew, and there wasn't a formal agreement. In the vast majority of interstate conflicts, there is some kind of negotiated end, and those range from the archetypal ceasefire only, those that only deal with the mechanics of the cessation of hostilities, which can nonetheless be extremely difficult to negotiate. The Korean War is the sort of archetype here, where the armistice deals exclusively with matters of the ceasefire and establishes the DMZ. There's a neutral party states monitoring commission, et cetera, et cetera. It was negotiated exclusively by uniformed military. And there was supposed to be a political process that I believe met once or twice and never led anywhere. But that document was exclusively dealing with the mechanics of a ceasefire. And then on the other side of the scale of sort of comprehensiveness, you can imagine a peace treaty that restores and normalizes relations between former belligerents. And, I think we're probably going to end up somewhere in the middle. I think it's pretty clear that, well, let me put it this way. Both Ukraine and Russia, if they agree on anything, they both have stated that they are interested in something more than just a ceasefire, more than an agreement that just deals with the mechanics of ceasing hostilities, that they have broader political and security issues that they respectively want addressed in the context of a negotiated end to war. We don't, there are these other concepts that have been sort of somewhat called into question about knowing when the time is right for this. Essentially, there was this concept of the mutual hurting stalemate that, thus presents the ideal time for a negotiated end. As it turns out, like we only know what's a mutually hurting stalemate in retrospect, and it's not a particularly useful tool in the moment. These are ultimately political decisions about war and peace, some of the most, consequential ones that leaders make. And they're usually not driven by a pure calculus of the likelihood of, the impact of necessarily the battlefield, particularly when, as I mentioned, the parties themselves have objectives that can't necessarily be achieved through battlefield outcomes alone. That if these are broader political and security questions, taking a village in Zaporizhia is not going to necessarily produce that outcome or even likely to produce that outcome. So I guess I would say that, we're likely to see this war will end in some negotiated fashion. The question is sort of how thick or thin the agreement ends up being, and how those different political desiderata of the two sides are addressed in that context.
I have one question on my end, and I see a lot of questions that are.
Sorry, Michael, can't hear you. You're
It's
not muted, but yeah, the microphone was
a dip in the volume. So I just have one final question, and sort of bypassing a little bit the constraints of domestic politics, which are real enough in the whole range of countries that are involved in supporting Ukraine. But let's just take, some of the U.S. and the countries of Europe as a unit here. What would you recommend in terms of war termination at the moment? What do you think would be the correct priorities? What do you think would be the best course of action? You don't have to assume that people will take your advice or address yourself to any particular country, because that bogs all of us down in certain complexities. But if we could distill an answer about war termination, and feel free to say that war termination is not the right choice at the moment if that's what you believe, but what would be the key priorities? What would be the right things to bear in mind and the right things to have as objective at the present moment? And I'll start with you, Sam, and then turn to you, Liana.
Okay, I think that there is I'm going to do this in sort of, I'll answer the immediate priority question. I do think that we're not going to get to a cessation of hostilities like overnight, and I mean to say that a full end to the hot phase of the war is not going to come with a in my view, is not likely to come with just a declaration, then suddenly everything stops. A more way in which that is likely to be both sustainable and plausible is a gradual de-escalation process that essentially widens the scope of partial ceasefires that in the end lead to a broader cessation of hostilities. And there are some partially agreed partial ceasefires between Russia and Ukraine that are essentially on the shelf, that have been reported on the civilian shipping in the Black Sea agreement that almost came to fruition about a year ago, and the non-strikes on critical infrastructure arrangement that was being discussed over the summer. These are partial ceasefires. They exclude certain, objects or geographies from the war, and they can be built upon. So I think, you want to create a process of gradual de-escalation that begins to build some degree of confidence in both sides' seriousness about it, if you were to go to get moving down that line. And the second thing I would say is that given that both parties are unlikely to go for just a ceasefire, or at least they've stated that they don't want that, at the very least, we can think about having multiple parallel processes in track simultaneously that deal with the other issues, and they can be, Ukraine West conversations, Russia West conversations, Ukraine Russia conversations, everyone in the room, but having, multiple tables dealing with multiple issues simultaneously that can be, mutually reinforcing.
Liana, please, the priorities and the most important policy prescriptions you would make, in general, not to any one government, but in general.
Yeah. I think the most important, but I just mentioned this before, I agree on that ceasefire, about everything that Sam has said here, but I think there needs to be a strong sign of willingness from the United States and from Europe that they're going to continue to support Ukraine militarily, right? Because that is a precondition to taking away any Russian hope that a ceasefire might be turned into a big. If Russia agrees to a ceasefire, knowing that there's no more U.S. military support coming for Ukraine, and Europeans cannot make up for a lack of U.S. military support for Ukraine, that's a recipe for disaster already. So that is the most important precondition, that the minimum level of Ukraine becoming a country that can defend itself, that has the independence to choose its future freely and so on, is the military part there. And we've seen this after Minsk, how ignoring the military part there has led to a repetition here. Then on the next steps, I do agree that multiple processes can reinforce each other, but I would probably caveat against the hope, but that there might be, and certainly is a Russian hope at the moment, that they can pick some, from their perspective, low-hanging fruits without having to give something in return for Ukraine conflict resolution, right? So reestablishment of embassy staffing, whatever the Russian side will try to get before they have to make serious concession or progress on Ukraine talks, they will try to take for themselves. And I think that's a risk if we over prioritize a normalization of relations with Russia over the outcome of Ukraine. That is, ending the war backwards, because there's a reason why the state of US-Russia relations is the way it is. And that has been Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine. And that should not be just a subset of problems that have to be solved, but it should be the problem that should be at the beginning of the process to be solved. And then patience is probably it's a bad policy prescription, but it's probably a good policy prescription. Patience on the European side, patience with the Trump administration, which is apparently figuring out its approach on the way. And hopefully patience that also gets us beyond diplomatic eclats and catastrophes, back to a track of mutually agreed policy aims that we want to pursue.
Thanks so much to both of you, and it's great to see all the good questions in the chat. So I will turn to these now and lump together two, one from an anonymous attendee and the other from Felipe Morgado. First, about confidence building measures with the Black Sea grain deal, or rather Black Sea ceasefire that has been proposed by the UN and Turkey. Might this provide a concrete next step? And then lessons learned from the Black Sea grain initiative and real existing deals that have been struck between Ukraine and Russia. Speaking to Sam's point about the number of outside countries that are engaged with this kind of diplomacy. Obviously, the US is important, the countries of Europe are important, and in this case, Turkey has been an important actor, and we could put in many other countries that have equities, as has already been mentioned, the Chinese peace plan, Brazilian peace plan, et cetera. But this is a precise question about these two models, sort of Black Sea-based models, as points of departure for negotiation. So let me start with Juliana and then turn to Sam.
I think there are two takeaways from the Black Sea situation. I think the one is that talks are possible, and if mediators are there who are credible with both sides, talks can succeed between Ukraine and Russia. But there's also a takeaway that the hard power that you have to back up does play a role, right? Because it was also Ukraine's military power and Ukraine's military prowess that allowed it to free the Black Sea corridor and to allow for shipments outside of Ukraine. And I think this is the mixture that we should also consider for the future of negotiations. Of course, we can talk, but we've seen in many other conflicts how Russia is using developments on the battlefield and changing developments on the battlefield while talks are continuing. We've seen the Syria process, for example. And so the situation on the battlefield and the role of military power and how it can be used as a leverage is because we will not be able to freeze the whole situation for as long as we talk. So that is definitely something to take into account.
Thank you so much.
The almost consummated agreement from March 2024 was quite clever in that it essentially codified a status quo rather than forced changes in either side's behavior. So there was this time after the grain deal itself fell apart, when immediately after it fell apart, both sides, decided to take aim at the other civilian shipping, and there were significant negative economic consequences for both sides for that, in the form of insurance premiums and other aspects. And then essentially a classic shelling, intra-war threshold of violence was created where both sides basically kept away from doing that. And that did, as Liana mentioned, have to do with the fact that Ukraine was able to use unmanned technology, uncrewed technology, to pose a threat to Russia's shipping, even not having a real navy of its own at that point. So, so there was already, and there has been essentially a moratorium on strikes on civilian shipping for the most part that is held. Simply because both sides, have an interest in sustaining it. And so the Turkey brokered agreement in itself, as reported at least, would not have been like a dramatic shift in actual behavior. But in that, it's sort of quite clever, right? Because it doesn't require, the military to make huge concessions on things that it really cares about, but nonetheless creates the sort of potential for confidence building and broader political positive feedback from a mutually agreed measure that appears on paper and thus could have a potential positive political knock-on effect. Just as a particular aspect of that arrangement that the questioner asked about.
So I feel like I know the two of you well enough to target questions in your respective directions. So I'll start first with you, Sam, but I'll read both questions in case, Sam, you want to jump onto the second one, which you're, of course, most welcome to do. So the first question is about Levada opinion polling, this is from Michael Launer, indicates the vast majority of Russians are opposed to returning any territory to Ukraine, which encompasses Crimea, DNR, LNR, Kherson, Zaporizhia oblasts. What makes you, the panelists, think that Putin would be willing to trade this territory for some kind of deal? And then the other question, which I see would be of great interest to you, Liana, is differences and similarities among the German, British, and French positions toward ending the conflict. So, Sam, if you wanna jump in, by all means, take the British, French, and German question. But I think that you'd wanna, my guess is you'd wanna weigh in on the question of territory and how that might be worked into some kind of agreement or negotiated deal.
Sure. Territory is extremely the question of territory and of Russia's occupation of almost 20% of Ukraine is an extremely emotional and evocative issue. It's a hugely important one in terms of international law. As far as the negotiation goes, my sense is that it's not going to be actually the subject of much negotiation, that the line of contact will end up largely being where it is when the guns fall silent. It will not be recognized as an international border, and by either side, really, in all likelihood. And it will be a conflict line and not. So I don't foresee massive territorial concessions coming through a negotiation process. One could imagine swaps or of particular geographies or joint use of particular economic assets, like the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, which is right along the line. But as far as significant negotiated territorial concessions, it just seems highly unlikely. And I would actually make the case that for neither side is that the most important issue. Now, at least.
Issue of territory.
Yep.
Okay.
That for even the way Zelensky has articulated it himself in recent months, for him, the question of security guarantees has been put above the prioritization of restoration of Ukraine's territorial integrity.
Liana, it's not that I want to make the question any more complicated than it already is, but if you wish, so France, Britain, and Germany have been mentioned, but the European Union certainly plays a role in all of this. It plays an important role in sanctions and will play an important role in war termination. And I think it would also be good if you'd be so inclined to say a few words about Scandinavia, Poland, and the Baltic republics, because they have strong interests in the whole question of what will happen with the war, and then this gives us something of a composite picture of the European landscape. But the question itself, to give it its due, the question from Matthew Kennedy was about France, Britain, and Germany.
Yeah. So France, let me take at France and the UK first. So France and the UK, even under the Biden administration, have been often more forward-leaning on Ukraine. They have signaled they would be ready to send long-range missiles to Ukraine. They have not hesitated to say that Ukraine must win this war, with Germany under Olaf Scholz had a more cautious position and has aligned itself very clearly with the Biden administration's concerns about escalation. What we see right now is that there are discussions going on in Europe, especially between the UK and France, on a European mission to Ukraine, and both the UK and France would be willing to go for that, to put troops on the ground in Ukraine, not on the front line, but as a tripwire deterrent force behind the front line. So if Russia attacks, European forces would not be the first in the line, it would be Ukraine that is in the line if Russia breaks a ceasefire, and the Europeans are sort of behind that. The German position on that is so far pretty unclear. So the likely to be new Chancellor Friedrich Merz is more forward-leaning on supporting Ukraine, also militarily, but he has not yet commented on a German role in the European mission. If that comes together, and the precondition from a European perspective is that they do want some kind of backstop from the United States, which seems increasingly unlikely to come, then Germany would, as it has often done, probably play a role in contributing something, but not being the lion's share of the effort there. The other perspective, I think it's relevant to mention the Polish perspective here. From a Polish national security perspective, there are big concerns about putting Polish troops into Ukraine because of the fear that this will undermine NATO Article 5 and the credibility of NATO's Article 5 if the United States does not come to help European forces in Ukraine, even if it's not committed to do so via through NATO, but that this will in fact mean or can encourage Vladimir Putin to think that the United States will also not come to the defense of Poland in that situation. So Poland has been more hesitant on this question. Overall, there is a discussion that I have not seen, not only in 20 years since the Iraq War, but probably post 1990, although it was certainly not yet in business in 1990, but a discussion about the need to contribute more to Europe's own defense and more fundamentally the fundamental mistrust towards the United States. One could also put it that way, that Europeans are seriously considering how divorce proceedings from the United States would look like and how they should handle this. And there are certainly huge dependencies on US military capabilities. But the trust in Article 5 and in the United States coming to the defense of Europeans, I would say, is at an all-time low, so low that hurdles that have been there in the past are now being overcome and speaking to each other, making money available, and so on. And again, I think this day and the conversation between Zelensky and Trump will certainly be something that Europeans draw their lessons from and will consider what such a conversation, such an approach from the United States means for European security in the future.
We've come to our final question the Institute from Sir John Scarlett. It seems we are not talking about a temporary ceasefire, but "quote unquote" gradual de-escalation across a range of issues. Can you cite evidence that Russia is looking for compromise on any of its key demands? Is it really feeling under significant pressure? So this is, I think, a really useful question on which to conclude, which is Russia's willingness or lack thereof when it comes to doing more than just a very gradual de-escalation, or perhaps doing even that. So we'll start with you, Liana, and then we'll turn to you, Sam.
Yeah, so it depends on whom you're listening to right now from the Russian side. So obviously Lavrov, Medvedev have put out the traditional aims, maximalist aims from the Russian side in negotiations. And there's certainly a hope from the Russian side that if they have to give in concessions, that with the approach that the current administration is taking, those concessions don't have to be too significant. But then again, the unpredictability in the administration's approach is something which also leads to caution. To think from a Moscow perspective that this is already done and over with in favor of Russia. The question of pressure will be crucial here. So will the Trump administration return to a strategy of exerting pressure on Russia in parallel to offering incentives, as we've seen in the first 2 weeks after the inauguration? If that comes back into play, the chances for Russian concession are certainly higher than just offering a US-Russia normalization and just offering incentives, as we've seen in the current approach.
Sam, I'm going to turn to you, and if you want to say a few words, because I know that.
Sorry, we're losing you again, Michael.
Sorry. Sam, I was just going to add in one thing, that there's a lively debate now among Russia watchers and the expert community about the Russian economy. And the Russian economy as a potential driver of a Russian willingness to make concessions or to negotiate. So if you want to comment on that, that would be great. Otherwise, just
sure.
Overall question is ideal.
So first, just to clarify, I was envisioning the first steps being a gradual de-escalation, and my hope is that there will be a robust negotiated settlement that minimizes the chances of war recurrence and and leaves us in a better place. But as to the question about Russian interest in all of this, so I think in the abstract we can point to lots of reasons why Russia has incentives to bring this to a close. They are, hemorrhaging both humans and materiel. They are their economy is suffering from the sanctions. They're in, a bad way globally. If you take a big look at where they stand geopolitically, I mean, I think this has been a disaster for Russia. But I think the bottom line is we don't really know the answer to this question about how prepared Russia is to engage, because there has not yet been a moment where, an offer has been made or a offer for negotiations has been put out there, and we have a clear Russian answer one way or the other. So until that happens, we're in this period of, where there is still yet to be a real table as concerns the end of war. And so both sides have the incentive to publicly stick to maximalist talking points so as to not be negotiating with themselves. So basically we can only test that proposition by actually, having a platform to do so. And when we talk about pressure and leverage, it's my view that there's a lot of leverage that has been built up over the course of these 3 years vis-a-vis Russia that could be used for specific reasons, but we need to know where exactly they are, where it is that we want them to be, and whether, what mechanisms can be used to get them from, one place to the other. And I just think that we're not there yet. And so it's both, too early to say that we know exactly how they would respond to this, and whether, in fact, we don't have enough leverage already. I don't know. And I think basically none of us do. And we're sort of in this moment of relative speculation because we're about to see this experiment play out.
Well, I think it's a very appropriate note of epistemological and intellectual humility on which to conclude. Seems absolutely correct for the topic, in my view. Liana and Sam, thank you so much for this, very rich, precise, and stimulating overview of the question of war termination on this consequential day in U.S.-Ukrainian relations. Thank you so much for coming to this conversation. Thanks for everyone else for tuning in. As mentioned, please, sort of follow our website for publications, podcasts, and other such discussions at the Kennan Institute, and there will be many more to come. So thank you so much for tuning in today.